Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/Pro Revenge. In today's episode, how my ancestor, supposedly, took down a racist businessman. Teacher makes false claim of me faking an injury, so my mom messes with her career. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. How my ancestor, supposedly, took down a racist businessman. This is an old story that have been told in my family for as long as I can remember. We're talking my grandfather was told it by his grandfather and so on. Note that this story has had close to 200 years to be embellished and twisted, so take everything with a grain of salt rather than scream fake. Even if only a fourth of the story is true, it's still a great story. This is the story of my ancestor we'll call John, because that's the name I've always been told. John was a black man in America during the time when slavery was dying out, his grandparents having been brought there from Africa along with their children. John eventually was freed through some means. I've heard both that he paid his way out, or the state he was in abolished slavery, and he was freed that way, and found himself fighting in the Civil War because he felt it was the right thing to do. During the war he became good friends with a man only known as Mitch, who supposedly came from money, but had joined against his parents' wishes because he believed in freedom for all. Again, grain of salt, the two were in the same regiment and made it through alive, though some relatives say Mitch lost a leg or an arm in the war. Fast forward to the end of the war, and John and his new wife Mary he'd met during the war used the money he'd earned to set up a small shop on the East Coast, most common city mentioned is Boston, in a small neighborhood. The shop became successful, John being a charming man and surprisingly savvy businessman. The neighborhood he'd set up and quickly growing as the city grew, meaning there were always customers who needed whatever it was he sold. I've heard everything from groceries to workers' tools. They lived happily and had 3 children together during the time, spending a decade there when suddenly, presumably accompanied by the roar of thunder and screeches of crows, Mr. Business arrived in town. Mr. Business has apparently been on the wrong side of the war and fought quite hard to keep his slaves, but was also smart enough to sell out other racists when he saw how the tides of the war were rolling, getting by with no losses except his free laborers. This had been the beginning of the end for his once successful plantation/farm, as all the workers he could find to replace his slaves had wanted things like pay for their services. He'd struggled to find loyal workers that didn't charge more than the absolute minimum, and after a series of bad harvests had chosen to pack up, sell his land and head east to find a new source of income. He arrived and began buying up local businesses that seemed profitable, and eventually found out about John's successful store. He was more than happy to discuss a fair price for the store. Until he saw the skin color of the owner, that is. 10 years not enough time to erase a lifetime of institutionalized racism. He began harassing John to sell his rinky-dink store and find a farm to work on, don't quote me, offering way below the actual value, and when laughed out of the store, began trying to sabotage John's business. Getting thugs to throw rocks through windows, sabotaging deliveries, making a scene in the store. John soldiered on though, having grown tragically used to fighting against racism. He also had a lot of friends in the community who helped keep the store floating. Then it was that John's oldest son, who was 13 to 14 at the time, found himself getting beaten up heading home at night from his job, again, blurry details, and wound up with a lot of scars that he'd supposedly been stuck with all his life. John had had enough, and as luck would have it, had an out, having been contacted by his old friend Mitch. Mitch was starting up a farm/plantation in the west/south/southwest and needed loyal workers. He'd offered John a foreman position, good pay, and a plot of land to live on with his family. This, dear readers, is when the revenge plan begins. John contacted Mr. Business, offering to sell at 75% what the shop was actually worth, and maybe because his other businesses hadn't worked out, he took it. However, John supplied the contract and proper solicitor to make things legal. The contract basically saying that after midnight of the date of signing, the shop and everything inside would transfer ownership to Mr. Business. Little did he know that that day up until midnight, the shop was having a massive clearance sale, selling everything not nailed down at ridiculous prices to a grateful neighborhood. When they closed up that night and mailed the keys to Mr. Business, there was little left to sell in the store, if anything. John never found out what happened next, as they left town soon after and never returned, but personally I'd like to think that Mr. Business arrived with his workers to an empty store with no deliveries coming, screaming and crying in the mud as he realized he'd been outsmarted by a lesser species. John and his family moved to work at Mitch's farm for the rest of their lives, John supposedly passing away in his 60s. Thank you for reading. Again, a lot of this is probably embellished if not straight up a fairy tale, but my family all treat it as a true story, and I felt it was too good of a story to not share here. Teacher makes false claim of me faking an injury, so my mom messes with her career. I apologize for the format, I'm typing this on my cracked phone screen. I, 15F, have had a long and elaborate history with injuries, especially breaking my arm. Starting from literally the day I was born, my health has been complicated. I have a few conditions but none serious enough to impact my daily life as I know it. I have a very weak immune system and somewhat easy to break bones. On top of that, I am the definition of clumsy, and I'm also a huge idiot who gets herself into dangerous situations for fun. My mom, 40F, has obviously known me from birth, and knows just the extent of my weird bad luck and health issues. I've broken my arms a collective 13 times over my entire life, and almost every time I got injured or sick, it seems somebody had something to say about it. IDKY, but teachers just love to say that students that get hurt often are attention-seeking fakers, and a lot of relationships with authority figures have been harmful because of this. Every time it's the same. For some reason a teacher doesn't believe me, they call me a liar in front of everyone, I get bullied for a while, and then I have to try and prove that I'm not faking. I could post so many stories about teachers doing this, but this is a story about the time my mom actually managed to get revenge. This all took place around 7th grade. I was 12 at the time, and I had broken my wrist by climbing on top of something I wasn't supposed to, and then falling off like a dumbass. My wrist was in a Velcro cast, since I'm very allergic to the regular cast material, as they figured out through many cases of trial and error. My teacher. Let's call her Mrs. Tablet since this took place while we were learning about Egyptian tablets. She taught history and our personalities clashed a bit. I'm more of a creative, adventurous, free thinker type, and she was very conservative, by the book, and proper. We hadn't had any real issues before this, but we just didn't mesh well. She was absent one day, and we had a sub in. I knew the sub as one of my teacher's friends and one of my bully's mom. I didn't like her, but I was still respectful in class, and just tried to get my work done. She got me in trouble for doodling on my paper once or twice, but other than that everything was fine, or so I thought. The next day I went into class like usual. We were working on an assignment about Egypt and their tables when Mrs. Tablet called me over to her desk. I went over, thinking she'd just get onto me for drawing on the back of my homework or something, only to get bombarded with a bunch of really weird questions. The interaction went something like, "Teacher, so Fire, do you know why I've called you up here? I know Fire isn't my Reddit name, but it's my IRL nickname, so I'm using it here." Me, "No ma'am, I can't say that I do." "Teacher, how long have you had that cast?" Me, "About a week now." "Why?" "Teacher, do you really need that cast?" Me, "Yes." "Teacher, well the substitute told me she saw you take it off." Me, "It's a cast, I can't take it off, it would hurt." "Teacher, so if I asked the class they'd say you need that cast?" Me, "Yes." "Teacher, and if I called your parents right now they'd say the same thing?" Me, "Yes, they were the ones that took me to the hospital." And she did this in front of the whole class. I was eventually dismissed and people looked at me weird for the rest of class. As I later learned, apparently the substitute had told Mrs. Tablet that I'd taken off my cast as soon as I left class. I didn't, and that I threw it in my locker like ha ha ha, I'm getting away with doing less work. So basically she pretended I was a bad guy in a crappy high school movie. IDK why she said this, but it had my teacher convinced that I was a liar and a fake. I technically could remove my cast since it was Velcro, but that would have been extremely painful, and it's not like I could just walk around without it. I wasn't going to make a big deal about it at the time, but it turns out she was serious about calling my parents. But she made the mistake of calling my mom. Now me and my mother don't have a perfect relationship, she has anger issues, so we don't always get along well, but she loves me very much and doesn't let people like this mess with me if she can stop it. According to my mom, Mrs. Tablet called her all cocky and said things like apparently your daughter is wearing a cast, did you know that? And well we all know how dramatic teenage girls can be. Especially unique kids like her. She apparently even threatened to have me suspended before my mom stopped her and tore her to shreds for talking about her child like that. I don't think I'm allowed to repeat what was said, but by the end, Mrs. Tablet had to retreat with her tail tucked between her legs. She started being even more cold to me after that day and started giving me unfair detentions for not sitting still and doodling on the side of my worksheets. Even then, outside of school we went to the same art studio sometimes. Weird that someone who hates art so much likes to paint, and poisoned the art director against me and got me put into a lower class. When me mom found out about this, she started the real revenge. My mom has never been a PTA mom. She honestly can't stand most of the PTA members, and their kids are chosen as favorites at my school, and use this power to bully others, including me and my friends. My mom is however friends with a very lovely woman on the county school board, which has more power than the PTA. She told her friend everything that had happened and supplied all the doctor's notes needed to prove I needed my cast. Her friend managed to convince the rest of the board that Mrs. Tablet was discriminating against an impaired student, given her comments about me being slower at work and just wearing the cast to slack off, along with detentions related to me not sitting still when she knew I had nervous movements and slight ADHD. At the art studio, my mother pulled me from the classes. I took it upon myself to inform the fellow kids about why, and rumors spread quickly. Soon enough kids were getting pulled left and right and my art teacher was pulling at strings to try and get the situation under control. I actually think the studio went into temporary closure before reopening again. She was suspended for a week to go under investigation, and it turns out she treated a lot of the unique, as she put it, students in a similar way. She was verbally reprimanded by 2 different departments, and instead of getting her standard raise over the next 3 years, she'll only get half of that. Not only that, but she had to retake a course on how to properly treat students, and if she's ever caught to cross this line again, she'll lose tenure. She'll just be getting her bonus back at the start of next school year, and I'd just like to say that I hope she learned her lesson, smiley face.